The last tool for purposes of analyzing the financial health of a company is called the uses and sources of funds. And this is extremely useful because it's just so simple, yet it provides us with so much potential, richness as far as understanding what's happening in the company. So let's start by simply describing what the process looks like. Just take the balance sheet for a specific company that you're trying to analyze and identify 2 years. The 2 years can be, back to back, let's say 2017, 2018, or it could be 2 or 3 years apart. The point is that you're trying to compare the balance sheet items for a specific year with respect to another year. And again, they don't have to be, back to back. You can have 2 or 3 years of difference between the two. Then you're going to identify certain key items that you think are interesting. And this is sometimes called a two-finger approach because with your two fingers, you can go down those two different columns of those two different years and kind of identify where you see the most, let's say, dramatic changes, right? And so you kind of choose which balance sheet items you want to concentrate on. For those items, we're going to estimate the deltas. Okay, the changes in those balance sheet items between those 2 years. Once you find the change, if the change reflects an increase of an asset, that is going to be classified as a use of funds. So if you see, for example, that inventory has gone up from 100 to 130, that delta of 30, because that change is positive and inventories are part of our assets, that is going to be classified as a use of funds. Similarly, if you find that a liability item that you have selected reflects a decrease. So let's say long-term debt, for example, went from 100 to 80. So the delta, the change is 20, negative 20, right? A decrease of 20. Then that decrease of a liability is also a use of funds. Why? Because in the first case, you are investing more in inventory. So that's a use of funds. In the second case, you're paying off your debt because it's decreasing from 100 to 80. That's also a use of funds. Right. Similarly, as far as classifying what are sources of funds, it's all symmetrical, right? A decrease of an asset implies a source of funding because of the fact that you are basically, the implication is that you are selling some of those assets and therefore generating some sort of revenue stream, right? Some sort of cash flow stream because of the sale of those assets. Or if you have things such as cash, the fact that cash decreases means that you have gone in and remove those cash holdings from the company. So therefore, thus a decrease of an asset implies a source of funds. Similarly, an increase of a liability would also imply a source of funds, right? Because again, if your long-term debt now goes from 120 to 150, you have increased your long-term debt, then that extra 30 implies that during that period of time, you have accessed additional funds from that from long-term financing. So an increase of an asset or a decrease of a liability is a use of funds. Or in the case of sources of funds, a decrease of an asset or an increase in liability. Okay, so as you can see, they're always, assets and liabilities are always opposite, right? Increase here, decrease here. And then the opposite occurs for the sources of funds. So I know that this sometimes it's very simple, right? It's a very simple and hopefully when you think about it, intuitive explanation. But let me show you in numbers what this means. All right. So suppose you're looking at a company. You're looking at 2 different years, 2016 and 2017, and you have selected certain items in the balance sheet that you are specifically interested in looking at and analyzing, right? You saw some significant changes. So on the asset side, you have cash, receivables, inventory, and fixed assets. So notice, for example, that in 2016, let's say inventory was 34,800. And it increased to 54,600 in 2017. So as before, you may remember, as before, we said, first find the step number 2, find the deltas in each item. And then depending on how you see the changes being positive or negative, or for an asset or for a liability, depending on those classifications, you will classify that change as a use or a source of funds. So let's do this. For inventory, the change, the delta, the difference, right? This is this column right here. The difference is 19,800. Notice that this change is positive. meaning that there is an increase of this asset. Because an increase of an asset is classified as a use of funds, okay? Therefore, this number is sent to the uses column, okay? So notice that this third column called difference or delta is just used to be able to help us identify, what's going on, okay? Look at cash, for example. Cash went from 10,800 to 600, okay? So the change or the difference is negative, right? And this negative sign is very useful because now we know that there has been a decrease of an asset, right? This asset is cash, and the decrease was for 10,200. Remember, if we go back, a decrease of an asset right here implies that that is a source of funds. So we use this number, the negative sign of this number, to help us place this number under the sources column. But once we place the number in the sources column, there's no more need for the negative sign. The negative sign is just to help us, remind ourselves that this is a decrease of this asset, or if it's positive, an increase of an asset. So we just use a sign just to be able to help us place that delta or difference in the sources and uses columns. Let's look at, for example, long-term debt and liabilities. Long-term debt went from 34,500 to 27,600. What was the delta of the change? It was negative 6,840. So we know that there has been a decrease, because it's negative, of a liability because it's long-term debt. A decrease of a liability is classified as a use of funds because you've used money in order to pay off that loan. And that way, 6,840 is placed under the uses column. So in the end, you find the deltas, you find the differences, you find this third column, and depending on whether it's an increase or a decrease, and it belongs to an asset or liability, you classify you put those numbers under the sources or uses columns. So far, it seems okay, but what is the usefulness? Now let's group these things together. Let's group all the uses and all the sources together. So in my exercise, here's what I did, right? And by the way, the beauty of this is that you don't have to, this is not an accounting test, so you don't have to necessarily demonstrate that there's a balance between the two. You're just taking the items that you think are more interesting and finding those differences and classifying them as uses and sources. So don't worry about the sum of these items being balancing out. Okay, that's not what this is about. I'm just showing you this for completeness, but don't worry about the fact that they have to be at a balance, right? Just worry about what the story is. So you grouped all the sources, you grouped all the uses, and now you can say a lot about what's happening to this company, right? For example, this company is a company that is basically mainly doing what? That is doing what? Most of its funding is going where? It's going to, where are the uses, right? The bulk of the uses of funds is going to investing in fixed assets. The next highest recipient of funds is inventory. So you can right now begin to suspect that, this company seems to be investing a lot in what appears to be growth. Okay. Now, where is the money coming from? Where is the money coming from? It's mainly coming from, where are the sources? The main source is payables. So this is a very interesting story that we don't know anything about this company. We haven't even read about the history and so on. But we, in a single snapshot or a single picture, can already begin to suspect that certain things that are going on, right? If a company is mainly investing the bulk of items in fixed assets for expansion, there's one yellow light that begins to turn on, and that is, okay, you're investing in the long term, right? But what are you using to fund that long-term investment? You're using basically payables. So you're leaning on your suppliers and short-term borrowing in order to invest in the longer term. So that already begins to be a source of concern, right? Because if you do that, when are you going to be able to pay back those short-term sources of funding? Remember, the main one is notes payables, which think of notes payables as a more formal suppliers document, right? So some suppliers have gotten a little bit impatient with you, and now they say, no, I don't want just to, the usual credit policy. Now you have to write me a piece of paper, an IOU that says, you're going to pay me back in a certain amount of time. So payables can also be a potential signal of some concern by suppliers. The second largest funding source is our suppliers themselves. So all of these, both of these are short-term sources of funding. So the concern is that, well, if you borrow in the short term, are you going to be able to pay in the short term, given that that your funds are going to fixed assets and typically are seem to be preparing for long-term growth? The answer is probably not. So you may start, this may help you put your ratio analysis in better perspective. What if you have already found that liquidity ratios are suffering, or some other financial ratios seem to indicate a difficulty for the firm to be able to comply with its payments in on time? What if the days payables are becoming longer and longer? All of that information that you have previously collected now it starts to make sense thanks to the uses and sources analysis, because the uses and sources analysis is like trying to generate a story behind what's going on in the company. And it's interesting to link the story to the analysis that you have already done as far as DuPont or the ratio analysis part. So in a one single snapshot, we know that this company is basically investing what seems to be preparing for longer term growth. It's investing in inventory too because it seems to be expecting higher sales. But that money is mainly coming from short term sources of funding and cash. By the way, the cash is a third, right? What should it be doing? Maybe it should be considering longer term sources of funding. But notice that the long term sources of funds are not part of the uses. These are actually not part, of the sources. These are actually part of the uses. So not only are they not funding in the long term their needs that seem to be longer term needs, but they're also paying off their long term debt. So this may be exacerbating the lack of maybe funds that they have, right? That can only be confirmed through ratio analysis. But as you can see, in one very simple snapshot, you can kind of generate a supplemental part of your overall analysis. Okay, so we go through these processes where we do ratio analysis, right? We go into DuPont and analyze things a little bit more deeply as far as profitability is concerned, and we apply sources and uses of funds in order to supplement the information. So this is a very simple yet very useful way of completing the story behind what may be happening in your company.